You're watching Dark Terror Files, where the stories aren't just told, they linger. Where are you listening from? Alone in your room? Driving through the dark? Drop a comment. I want to know who's out there. Rain hammered my oilskin coat as I stood in the Ironton Cemetery, shovel in hand, piling dirt onto Luther Crane's casket. October in Ohio ain't kind, cold seeps into your bones, and the sky's always spitting like it's got a grudge. I'm 58, too old for this, but the town's got nobody else to bury its dead. Used to work the steel mills till they rusted out, like everything else around here. Now it's just me, Walt Garner, digging graves in a town that's half dead itself. Luther was a nobody, a drifter, killed by a hit and run on Route 52. No family, no ID, just a crumpled pack of Marlboros in his pocket. The Methodist Church, run by that oddball Pastor Elias, paid for the burial. Why they cared about some vagrant, I didn't ask. I embalmed him, sewed his wounds, dressed him in a thrift store suit, and sealed the pine box myself. Just another name in my ledger. The shovel bit into the mud, each scoop heavier than the last. Dusk painted the cemetery in grays, headstones leaning like tired old men. The mill's skeletons loomed across the river, their smokestacks clawing at the clouds. I paused to wipe rain from my face, my breath steaming in the chill. Something felt off, maybe the way the wind hissed through the oaks, or how Luther's temporary marker, a cheap wooden cross, seemed to tilt just wrong. I shook it off. Too many late nights. Too much cheap whiskey. I tamped down the last of the dirt and signed the death certificate in my truck, the ink smudging in the damp. Luther Crane was gone. Buried. Done. That's what I told myself as I drove back to my clapboard house on the edge of town, the wipers slapping time to a song I couldn't place. 3 nights later, I was nursing a beer in my living room, the TV muttering about some factory closing up in Youngstown. The rain hadn't let up, pounding the roof like it wanted in. My house smelled of damp wood and regret, same as always. Then came the knock. 3 slow thumps, heavy, like someone was testing the door's weight. I froze, bottle halfway to my lips. Nobody visits me. Not since Maggie left a decade back. Tired of my drinking and my silences. The knock came again, deliberate, patient. My gut twisted. I set the beer down, grabbed the baseball bat by the couch, and crept to the door. The porch light flickered through the peephole, casting shadows on a figure in a gray suit. I yanked the door open, bat raised, and there he was, Luther Crane. Rain streamed down his face, his skin pale as bone, eyes wide and unblinking. The stitches I'd sewn across his cheek gleamed like black thread in the light. "Walt," he said, voice like gravel underfoot. "You buried me wrong." I stumbled back, the bat clattering to the floor. This wasn't real. I'd seen him dead chest still, eyes glassed over. I'd closed the casket myself. But those eyes now, they knew me. Knew the way I'd fumbled the needle, the way I'd whispered an apology as I lowered him into the ground. "Get out," I croaked, slamming the door. My hands shook as I bolted it, heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned against the wall, telling myself it was a dream, a trick of the booze. But then I saw the floor-muddy footprints, wet and fresh, trailing from the door to nowhere. I grabbed my flashlight and forced myself outside. rain soaking me through. The cemetery was a half-mile walk, but I had to see it. The grave was there, just as I'd left it, but the dirt was loose, churned up like something had clawed its way out. My knees buckled. I'd buried him, signed the papers, done it all right. But those footprints, that voice, they knew something. Something only a dead man could know. The rain didn't stop, and neither did the questions clawing at my skull. I sat at my kitchen table. The ledger from the funeral home spread open under a flickering bulb. Pages of names, dates, causes of death, my life's work in ink and paper. Luther Crane's entry was there. Last line on the last page. October 2nd, 2025. Hit and run. Buried. Ironton Cemetery. My handwriting. Sloppy from exhaustion. But mine. Or was it? The loops on the L looked wrong. Too sharp. Like someone else had held the pen. I rubbed my eyes. The whiskey bottle tempting me from the counter. No, not tonight. I needed to think straight. Luther's face kept flashing in my mind, those unblinking eyes. The stitches pulling tight against his cheek. You buried me wrong, he'd said. What the hell did that mean? I'd done my job, same as always. Embalmed him proper, sealed the casket, shoveled the dirt. But that grave, churned up like a fresh wound, and those footprints on my porch, they weren't lies. I flipped back through the ledger, years peeling away. 2024, 2023, all the way to the 90s, when the mills shut down and Ironton started dying. Names I knew: old mill workers, widows, kids who didn't make it past winter. But something nagged me, a gap I couldn't place. I kept seeing Luther standing in the rain, his voice cutting through the storm. He knew something I didn't, something I'd forgotten or didn't want to remember. The clock ticked past midnight, rain drumming the windows. I grabbed my coat and headed to the funeral home, a squat brick building next to the church. The ledger wasn't enough. I needed the burial records. The ones Pastor Elias used to oversee. He'd always been there, watching me work. His eyes sharp, like he saw more than he let on. I hadn't thought of him in years, but now his face was creeping back, like a shadow moving underwater. The funeral home smelled of formaldehyde and dust, the kind of place that makes your skin crawl even if you're used to it. I fumbled with my keys, the lock sticking like it knew I shouldn't be here. Inside, the filing cabinets stood like sentinels, stuffed with records going back decades. I pulled open the drawer for 2025, fingers brushing over yellowed folders. Luther's file was there, but the death certificate was missing. Just a blank sheet where it should have been. My signature scrawled at the bottom. My chest tightened. I'd signed it. I knew I had. I could still feel the pen in my hand, the rain smudging the ink. I dug deeper, pulling files from the 80s, when the town was bleeding jobs and people. Names I didn't recognize: Clara Hensley, Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver. None of them had headstones. No obits in the local paper, just entries in Elias's neat script, marked buried, per church request. I stepped outside, the church looming next door, its steeple a black spike against the storm. The Methodists hadn't held service here in years, not since Elias passed in '90, but I remembered his voice, low and certain, talking about salvation while I dug graves. He'd paid for Luther's burial. No questions asked. Why? I crossed the lot, mud sucking at my boots, and tried the church door. Locked. My flashlight caught something on the ground, more footprints. Fresh in the muck, leading to the cemetery. Not mine. Too small. Too deliberate. My pulse hammered as I followed them, the beam shaking in my hand. The trail stopped at Luther's grave. The dirt was smoother now, like someone had tried to cover their tracks. But a single handprint pressed into the mud, fingers splayed like a plea. I backed away, heart pounding. Luther's voice echoed in my head. You buried me wrong. But it wasn't just him. Those names in the files, the ones nobody remembered, they were tied to this place, to Elias. To me, I glanced back at the church, its windows dark as blind eyes. Whatever I'd done, whatever I'd forgotten, it was waiting in there, and it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't go home, not with that handprint burned into my mind, pressed into the mud like a warning. The cemetery air clung to me, damp and sour. As I trudged back to my truck, rain blurred the world. But I swore I saw something move between the headstones, a shadow too tall, too thin, slipping behind an oak. My flashlight caught nothing but wet leaves and crooked graves. Maybe it was just the whiskey I hadn't drunk, playing tricks. Or maybe it was Luther, watching me. Back in my kitchen, I poured coffee, hands shaking so bad it spilled on the counter. The clock read 2 a. Mo! But sleep wasn't coming. Those names from the church files, Clara Hensley, Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver, kept circling my head like vultures. I'd lived in Ironton my whole life, worked the mills, buried the dead. How did I not remember them? And why was my signature on those blank pages, like I'd been sleepwalking through my own life? I dug out an old photo from a shoebox under the sink, me and Pastor Elias. 1989, standing outside the church. I was younger, leaner, but my eyes looked hollow, like I was already carrying something heavy. Elias had his hand on my shoulder, his smile sharp as a blade. He'd always talked about saving Ironton, his voice like a hymn you couldn't shake. I'd listened, nodded, dug where he told me. But what had I buried besides bodies? The rain pounded harder, and I heard it again, 3 slow knocks at the door. My heart lurched. I grabbed the bat, crept to the peephole. Nothing but darkness, rain slicing through the porch light. I opened the door, bat raised, and saw only wet boards and empty night. But there, on the steps, was a single muddy footprint. Too small for my boots, too small for Luther's. I didn't sleep. Dawn came gray and heavy, the rain finally easing to a drizzle. I drove to the cemetery, my truck rattling over potholes. I had to see Luther's grave again. Had to know I wasn't losing it. The mud was slick under my boots, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. His plot looked untouched now. No handprint, no churned dirt, but it felt wrong, like the ground was holding its breath. I wandered deeper into the cemetery, past the neat rows of headstones for mill workers and their wives, to the older section where the markers were weathered, half sunk. That's where I found them, unmarked graves, just mounds of earth. No names, no dates. I counted 10, maybe more, hidden under weeds. My stomach twisted. Those names from the files, the ones Elias had written down, they belonged here, didn't they? I knelt by one mound, grass poking through like stubble. My fingers brushed the dirt, and a chill ran through me, sharp as a blade. I saw Luther in my mind, standing in the rain, his stitched face accusing. "You buried me wrong," he'd said. But what if it wasn't just him? What if I'd buried others? People who weren't dead? The thought hit like a punch, and I staggered back. Breath short, I drove to the library, a crumbling brick building downtown, to check the town records. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, watched me with nervous eyes as I pulled microfiche from the 80s. Ironton was falling apart back then, mills closing, families leaving, but no trace of Clara, Thomas, or Mary Jo. No obits, no missing persons reports, just gaps, like they'd been erased. Mrs. Hargrove leaned over, her voice a whisper. "Some things are better left alone." "Walt!" Her hands trembled, and I caught a flicker of fear in her eyes, like she knew more than she'd say. I left with nothing but questions, the weight of those unmarked graves pressing on my chest. Luther was out there, or something wearing his face, and he was pulling me towards something I'd forgotten, something I'd done. The cemetery was calling me back, like a hook snagged in my gut. I went at dusk, when the light bleeds out, and Ironton feels like a ghost town, even to the living. The air was heavy, smelling of wet stone and rust from the old mills across the river. I carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the fog as I headed for the unmarked graves. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, eyes boring into me from the shadows. Then I saw him, Luther Crane, standing by a gnarled oak at the cemetery's edge. His gray suit hung loose, rain-soaked, the stitches on his face glinting like black wire. He didn't move, just stared at a sunken mound, one of those nameless graves. I froze, my breath catching. "Luther," I called, voice hoarse. He didn't turn, but his head tilted, like he was listening to something under the earth. I stepped closer, boots sinking in the mud. "What do you want?" I asked, louder, anger edging out fear. He moved then, slow, like his joints were rusted. His lips parted, and he muttered names: Clara Hensley, Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver, the same ones from Elias's files. His voice was wrong, too low, like it came from somewhere deeper than his throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't budge. "You're dead," I said, more to myself than him. "I buried you." He turned, his eyes unblinking, pale as frost. "You buried us all," he said, and pointed at the mound. The flashlight shook in my hand as I aimed it at the ground. No marker, no name, just a faint outline in the dirt, like someone had smoothed it over years ago. I stumbled back, heart hammering. Luther didn't follow. He just stood there, staring. As the fog swallowed him up, I drove home, the names he'd spoken looping in my head. Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo. They weren't just names, they were people, and I'd helped erase them. But how? And why was Luther back, dragging it all to the surface? I couldn't stay away from the church. It squatted next to the cemetery, its steeple stabbing the gray sky like an accusation. I hadn't been inside since Pastor Elias died in '90, but now it felt like the only place with answers. The door was still locked, but I found a loose board on a basement window, pried it open, and crawled through. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something sharper, like old incense. My flashlight swept over pews draped in cobwebs. hymnals scattered like fallen leaves. In the basement, I found a locked filing cabinet, rusted but intact. I broke it open with a crowbar, the metal screeching loud enough to wake the dead. Inside were more of Elias's records, handwritten in his tight script, pages of burials, but not the official ones. These were different names I didn't know. Dates from the 80s, all marked Red Vespers. My hands shook as I read. Clara Hensley, 1983. Thomas Pike, 1985. Mary Jo Weaver, 1987. My signature was there, again and again, scrawled at the bottom like a confession. I leaned against the wall, the room spinning. I remembered nights with Elias, his voice soft but heavy, talking about cleansing Ironton after the mills shut down. I'd been drunk half the time, nodding along, digging where he pointed. But burying people, living people, my mind recoiled. But the signatures didn't lie. A noise snapped me out of it, a slow, deliberate knock from upstairs. My flashlight flickered, and the air turned cold, like someone had opened a grave. I climbed the stairs, crowbar in hand, and pushed open the sanctuary door. Nothing, just shadows and silence. But on the altar, where Elias used to preach, was a single muddy handprint, fresh and wet. I backed out, pulse racing, and drove to the diner on Main Street, needing light. People, anything to shake the chill. The waitress, Jenny, gave me a tired smile, but her eyes lingered too long, like she knew something was wrong. "You okay?" "Walt," she asked. I nodded, sipping coffee that tasted like ash. But I wasn't okay. The past was creeping in. And it wasn't just Luther. It was me. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed like a headache. But I couldn't go home. Not with that muddy handprint on the church altar stuck in my head, like it was branded there. I nursed my coffee, the steam curling up like ghosts, while Jenny wiped down counters across the room. The clock said 4:00. Too early for anyone else in Ironton to be awake. But I wasn't shake, the feeling I wasn't alone. I kept hearing them: Clara Hensley, Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver. Their names whispered in my mind, soft as leaves skittering over pavement. I pulled out the notebook where I'd jotted down what I'd found in the church files. Red Vespers. The words felt wrong, like a curse I shouldn't touch. My signature was sketched next to each name, but I didn't remember writing them. I didn't remember those people, those graves. Yet the weight of them pressed on my chest, heavy as wet earth. I drove back to the cemetery, needing to see those unmarked mounds again. The fog was thick, swallowing the headstones, and the air smelled of rust and rot. My flashlight caught the oak where I'd seen Luther last, its branches clawing at the sky. I knelt by one of the nameless graves, the dirt cold under my fingers. "Who are you?" I whispered, half expecting an answer. The wind shifted, and I heard it a low murmur, like voices trapped underground. "Clara. Thomas. Mary Jo." I jerked back, heart slamming against my ribs. The fog swirled, and for a second, I swore I saw shapes moving, faint and gray. Between the graves, I swung the flashlight, but they were gone. Just tricks of the light, I told myself, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stumbled to my truck, the names louder now, like they were calling me back. Luther had started this, dragging these ghosts up with him, I had to find him, make him explain. But deep down, I knew he wasn't the answer. The answer was in me, buried somewhere I didn't want to look. Morning came, gray and damp. But I hadn't slept. I sat in my living room, the shoebox of old photos open on the coffee table. I'd avoided it for years, afraid of what I'd find. But now I needed answers. Something to make sense of the names, the graves. Luther's stitched-up face accusing me in the rain. I found the photo again, me and Pastor Elias. 1989, outside the church. My face looked wrong, eyes sunken, like I was carrying a secret even then. Elias's hand rested on my shoulder, his smile too sharp, like he knew something I didn't. I remembered his voice, smooth and heavy, talking about saving Ironton while the mills shut down and the town bled out. I'd drunk with him, listened to him, dug where he told me. But what else had I done? I flipped through more photos. Elias at the pulpit, Elias blessing a grave, Elias with a group of men I didn't recognize, their faces grim. One picture stopped me cold. A candlelit room, maybe the church basement, with a circle of chairs and a table draped in red cloth. I was there, standing in the corner, my face half hidden in shadow. Red Vespers. The words from the files hit like a slap. A knock at the door made me flinch, the photo slipping from my hand. I grabbed my bat, heart racing, and peered through the peephole. Nobody, just rain pooling on the porch. But when I opened the door, a folded piece of paper lay on the mat, damp and yellowed. I unfolded it, my fingers numb. It was a page from the church records, listing Clara Hensley's burial. 1983. My signature was at the bottom, and scrawled in red ink. Forgive us, Walt. I slammed the door, breath short. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in. I didn't know who left the note, but it wasn't Luther. His kind didn't need paper. They spoke through mud and shadows. This was someone else, someone living, who knew what I'd done. I looked at the photo again, Elias's smile mocking me. Whatever I'd buried. It wasn't just bodies. It was me. The note, forgive us. Walt burned a hole in my pocket as I walked down Main Street, the morning fog wrapping Ironton like a shroud. The town was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels like it's hiding something. Storefronts stood empty, their windows dark, reflecting my haggard face. I hadn't slept in days, and my reflection looked like a stranger, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight, like I was already half buried. I headed for the diner, needing to talk to someone. Anyone who might remember the 80s when the mills died and Elias held sway. Jenny was behind the counter, pouring coffee for a trucker. I slid onto a stool, the note crumpled in my fist. Jenny, I said, keeping my voice low. You ever hear of something called the Red Vespers? Her hand froze mid-pour, coffee splashing on the counter. Where'd you hear that? She asked, eyes darting to the door like she expected someone to walk in. I leaned closer, showing her the note. Her face paled, and she pushed it back. You don't want to dig into that, Walt. Nobody does. I pressed her, but she clammed up, busying herself with dishes. The trucker glanced over, then looked away fast, like he knew better than to listen. I left the diner, the note heavier than ever. The town felt like it was watching me, every shuttered window a closed eye. I passed the old mill, its smokestacks looming like tombstones, and remembered Elias's sermons about cleansing Ironton. Had I been part of it? Had I buried people who weren't dead? The thought made my stomach churn. But the names Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo kept whispering Hawkins. Thomas, you buried us all. Luther had said. I needed to know what he meant, what I'd done. I drove to my house. The notes red ink. Forgive us. Walt searing my mind. The words felt like a plea or a threat, and I couldn't tell which. I locked the door, pulled the blinds, and sat in the dim glow of my lamp. The old photo of me and Elias staring up from the coffee table. My hands shook as I poured a shot of whiskey, the burn doing nothing to quiet the noise in my head. I closed my eyes, and it came like a flood. A memory, sharp and jagged. The church basement, 1987. Candles flickering on a table draped in red cloth. Elias's voice, low and rhythmic, chanting about sacrifices for Ironton's soul. I saw myself there, younger, drunk, nodding as he handed me a shovel. You're doing God's work, Walt, he'd said. I dug graves that night, and others, believing it was right. But the faces of those I buried were blank, like holes in my mind. I snapped my eyes open, heart pounding. The photo of Elias seemed to watch me, his smile a knife's edge. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the cemetery, needing to face those unmarked graves again. The fog was gone, but the air felt heavy, like the ground itself was breathing. I stood over one of the nameless mounds, the dirt cold and damp. Clara Hensley, I whispered, testing the name. The wind stirred, and I swore I heard a sigh, faint as a dying breath. I walked the rows, counting 23 unmarked graves, each one a secret Elias had made me keep. My signature was on those files. My hands had dug the earth. But I couldn't remember their faces, their voices, only the weight of the shovel, the smell of soil, the flicker of candlelight in that basement. Back home, I found another note slipped under my door. Same yellowed paper, same red ink. They're still here, Walt. My knees buckled. I checked the porch empty, just like before. But the air felt wrong, too still, like the town was holding its breath. I clutched the note, my mind screaming one question. Who was leaving these? Not Luther. Someone living. Someone who knew my sins better than I did. The note. They're still here. Walt sat heavy in my hand. The red ink like blood under the dim light of my kitchen. I hadn't slept in days, and the world felt thin, like I could tear through it and find something awful waiting. I drove to the cemetery at dawn, the sky bruised purple, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and rust. The unmarked graves were there, 23 silent mounds, each one a weight on my soul. I dug them, or so the files said, but my memories were holes, dark and empty. I walked to Luther's grave, half expecting him to be there, stitched face glaring. Instead, I found something worse, a rusted iron gate at the cemetery's edge, hidden behind overgrown brambles. I'd never seen it before, not in all my years burying Ironton's dead. It was old, etched with words too worn to read. But one phrase stood out. Only the named shall pass. My flashlight flickered. The beam catching a figure beyond the gate, Luther. His pale eyes locked on me, unblinking, You buried us all, he said, voice like gravel grinding underfoot. He pointed to the graves, then to me. You knew. I gripped the gate, cold metal biting my palms. I don't remember, I snapped, but my voice cracked. Luther stepped closer, his suit hanging loose, stitches pulling tight. Clara cried for her son, he said. Thomas begged for air. Mary Jo prayed. Each name hit like a hammer, and I saw flashes, hands clawing dirt, muffled screams, my shovel sealing them in. I stumbled back, the gate rattling. Luther didn't follow, just watched, his form flickering like a bad signal. I ran to my truck, heart pounding, the names screaming in my head. I hadn't just buried them. I'd done something, under Elias's spell, and Luther was here to make me face it. I couldn't stay away from the church, not after seeing that gate. It was noon, but Ironton felt frozen, the streets empty, the mill's smokestacks silent. The church loomed, its windows like dead eyes. I jimmied the basement window again, crawling into the dark. The air was colder now, sharp with that strange incense smell, like something burned long ago. I went straight for the filing cabinet, its broken lock gaping. I rifled through more of Elias's records, my hands shaking as I found another list, 23 names, same as the graves, all marked red vespers, complete. My signature was there, every page, but the dates blurred together, 1983, 1985, 1987. I saw myself in the basement, younger, drunk. Elias's voice droning about sacrifices to save the town. I'd nodded, dug, believed him. But what had I buried? A creak came from deeper in the basement, behind a door I'd never noticed, half hidden by crates. It was heavy oak, locked, with a cross carved into the wood. I ran my fingers over it, feeling a pulse in the air, like the church was alive. I didn't have a key, but I remembered the one in my attic, tucked in a box with old photos. Had it been Elias's? I smashed the crates aside, the crowbar heavy in my hand. But the door wouldn't budge. Something scratched behind it, faint, like nails on wood. I pressed my ear to the door, and there it was, whispers, overlapping, desperate. Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo. My knees buckled, and I slid to the floor, the crowbar clattering. They weren't dead, not all of them. I'd buried them alive, or helped Elias do it, and now they were still here, trapped somewhere beyond that door. I staggered out, the church's silence pressing on me like a weight. Back home, I found the key in the attic, its cross engraving matching the door. It felt heavy, like it carried the whole town's sins. I didn't want to go back, but Luther's voice echoed in my head. You knew, and the worst part, I was starting to believe him. The key sat heavy in my palm, its cross engraving biting into my skin as I stood outside the church. Night had fallen, and Ironton was a ghost town. The only sound, the distant hum of a train crossing the river. The air smelled of rust and rain, and my breath fogged in the chill. I didn't want to go back to that basement, to that locked door. But the whispers, Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo were louder now, clawing at my skull. Luther's words, you buried us all, were a chain dragging me back. I slipped through the basement window, the church's darkness swallowing me whole. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. The oak door was there, its carved cross glowing faintly, like it was waiting. I slid the key into the lock, my hand shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. The mechanism clicked, loud as a gunshot, and the door creaked open, releasing a gust of cold air that stank of damp stone and something sour, like decay. I stepped inside, the flashlight catching a narrow staircase descending into the dark. My memories surged, sharp and unwanted Elias's voice, low and fervent, chanting about the red vespers in this very basement. I saw myself, younger, drunk, holding a shovel as he lit candles on a red-draped table. For Ironton's soul, he'd said, his eyes burning with purpose. I'd nodded, too lost in whiskey and desperation to question him. But the faces of those we buried, Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo, were blanks, erased by time or something worse. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step pulling me deeper into the church's secrets. At the bottom, the air was thick, pressing against my chest. The flashlight caught a stone wall, etched with names, 23 of them, the same from the files. My signature was carved beside them, crude and uneven, like I'd done it in a trance. My stomach lurched. I hadn't just buried them. I'd marked them, sealed them here, under Elias's spell. The chamber was small, barely bigger than a crypt, the walls slick with damp. The names carved into the stone seemed to pulse under my flashlight. Clara Hensley, Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver, and 20 others. My signature was there, over and over, accusing me. I touched one, Clara's, and the stone was cold, but it hummed, like a heartbeat trapped inside. I heard it then, a whisper, faint but clear, coming from the wall itself. Walt, it said, soft as a sigh. I staggered back, the flashlight slipping, plunging the room into darkness. My breath came in gasps, the air so thick it choked me. I fumbled for the light, my hands shaking. And when it snapped back on, Luther was there, standing in the center of the chamber. His stitched face was pale, his eyes like frost, unblinking. You knew, he said, voice grinding like stone on stone. I didn't. I shouted, but my voice broke. I don't remember. He stepped closer, his suit fraying at the seams, mud dripping from his shoes. You chose, he said. You dug. You sealed us. I saw flashes, hands pounding inside caskets, muffled cries, my shovel piling dirt. Elias's voice echoed in my head. This is salvation, Walt. I clutched the wall, my knees weak. Why are you here? I whispered. Luther's head tilted, his stitches pulling tight. To name them, he said. To make you remember. He pointed to the wall, and the whispers grew louder. A chorus of voices begging, pleading. Clara's voice was clearest, calling for a son I didn't know. I slid to the floor, the key clattering beside me. I don't know how long I sat there, the voices circling me like vultures. When I finally stood, Luther was gone, but the air felt heavier, like the chamber was alive, watching. I stumbled up the stairs, the door slamming shut behind me. Outside, the cemetery was silent, but the unmarked graves seemed to glow under the moonlight. Waiting. I knew I couldn't run from this. The key, the names, my signature. They were all pieces of a truth I'd buried, and it was digging its way back up. I staggered out of the church basement, the key still clutched in my fist, its cross engraving cutting into my palm. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and damp. But it couldn't shake the voices echoing in my head. Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo. All 23 names carved into that stone wall. My signature was there, etched beside them. Proof I'd been part of something monstrous. I leaned against the church, the brick rough under my hands, and tried to breathe. Ironton was silent, the mill's smokestacks black against the moon. But the cemetery beyond seemed to hum, like it was waiting for me to confess. I drove home, the key on the passenger seat like a live thing. My living room was too small, the walls pressing in as I sat with the whiskey bottle unopened. I couldn't drink. Not now. The memories were coming back. Sharp as broken glass, Elias in the basement. His red-draped table lit by candles. His voice promising salvation while I dug graves. I saw myself, numb from booze and despair, burying people who weren't dead. Clara's voice in the chamber, calling for her son, tore at me. Had I heard her scream as I shoveled dirt? I pulled out the church files again, the ones with my signature. 23 names, 23 unmarked graves, red vespers, complete. The words mocked me. Elias had called it a ritual to save Ironton. But what had it saved? The town was dying anyway. Its heart rusted out. I traced Clara's name, and my hand shook. I'm sorry, I whispered. But the words felt hollow. Lost in the silence of my empty house. A shadow moved outside my window, too quick to catch. I grabbed my flashlight, heart racing. But the porch was empty. Just another note, yellowed and damp, pinned to the door. They wait for you. Walt. The red ink glistened like it was fresh. I crumpled it, my chest tight. Someone in this town knew what I'd done, and they weren't letting me forget. I couldn't stay in the house, not with those notes piling up like accusations. I drove to the diner, the only place in Ironton still open at 3 a.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed, making my head throb. But I needed to talk, to make sense of the names, the graves. Luther's stitched face haunting me. Jenny was there, wiping down tables, her eyes tired but sharp. I slid into a booth, the files tucked under my arm, and waved her over. Jenny, I said, voice low. I need to know about the red vespers. Her face tightened, and she glanced at the empty diner like someone might hear. I told you. Walt, let it go, she whispered, but I pushed the files toward her. Open to Clara's name. I can't, I said. I buried these people. I think they were alive. She sat across from me, hands twisting her apron. My dad used to talk about Elias, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Said he had the town under a spell in the 80s. When the mills closed, people were desperate, losing everything. Elias promised to fix it, said God needed sacrifices. Her eyes met mine, and I saw fear there, old and deep. You were always with him. Walt. Digging. I felt sick, the coffee turning sour in my gut. I don't remember, I said, but it was a lie. I remembered the shovel, the dirt, Elias's voice like a hymn. Jenny leaned closer. They called it the Red Vespers. Nobody knew what it was, but people disappeared. Drifters, loners, folks nobody'd miss. My dad said you buried them out back. In the cemetery. I gripped the table, the world tilting. Why didn't anyone stop him? I asked. She shook her head. They were scared. Elias said it was for Ironton's soul. She paused. Then added, some said he wasn't working for God. I left the diner, Jenny's words ringing in my ears. The cemetery was dark, but I saw Luther again, standing by the iron gate, his pale eyes fixed on me. Name them, he said, voice like a cold wind. I wanted to scream, I didn't know how, but the truth was heavier. I was afraid of what naming them would mean for me. Jenny's words followed me like a shadow as I drove through Ironton's empty streets, the mill's smokestacks looming like judges in the dawn's gray light. You were always with him. Walt, digging. The truth was a knife in my chest. I'd buried people for Elias, maybe alive, and called it salvation, the cemetery gate. Those words etched in iron, only the named shall pass, felt like a command I couldn't ignore. I parked by the church, the key with its cross engraving heavy in my pocket. The cemetery was silent, the unmarked graves glowing faintly under the morning mist. I stood before the rusted iron gate, its bars cold and slick with dew. Luther was there, his stitched face half hidden in the fog, his voice a low rasp. Open it, Walt, he said, pointing to the gate. Name them. My hand shook as I pulled out the key, its weight pulling me towards something I didn't want to face. I remembered more now, Elias's basement, the red-draped table, the candles flickering as he chanted about cleansing Ironton's soul. I'd been drunk, broken from the mill closures, nodding as he handed me the shovel. But the faces Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo were still shadows, their screams muffled in my mind. Had I known they were alive? Had I chosen to forget? The key slid into the gate's lock, the click echoing like a gunshot. The bars creaked open, revealing a stone passage descending into the earth, the air thick with the smell of damp and decay. Luther's eyes gleamed, unblinking. They're waiting, he said, and stepped into the dark. I followed, my flashlight flickering, my heart pounding like it wanted out. The passage was narrow, the walls etched with crosses, and the whispers started again, Clara's voice, Thomas's, Mary Jo's, calling from somewhere deeper. I wanted to turn back, but the gate slammed shut behind me. The sound final. Luther's form flickered ahead, more shadow than man. I wasn't just following him, I was following my own sins. Buried deep, but clawing their way up. The passage opened into a chamber, smaller than the church basement, its stone walls slick and cold. My flashlight caught the names again, 23 of them. Carved deep, my signature scratched beside each one. Clara Hensley, Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver. The air hummed, like the stones were alive, and the whispers were louder now. A chorus of pain and pleas. My knees buckled, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Luther stood in the center, his suit fraying, his stitches pulling like they might split. You buried us, he said, his voice echoing off the walls. You sealed us for Elias. I shook my head, tears burning my eyes. I didn't know, I said, but it sounded weak, a lie even to me. I saw Flash's caskets closing, dirt falling, Elias's voice promising redemption while I worked. I'd believed him, or wanted to, when Ironton was crumbling and I had nothing left. I touched Clara's name on the wall, and the stone pulsed, warm for a moment, like a heartbeat. She had a son, Luther said, his eyes fixed on me. You heard her cry. I remembered now a woman's voice, muffled, begging as I shoveled dirt. My stomach churned, and I leaned against the wall, fighting the urge to vomit. Why me? I whispered. Luther stepped closer, his breath cold as the grave. You were the key holder, he said. Elias chose you. The chamber seemed to shrink, the air so thick I could barely breathe. The names glowed faintly, their whispers growing desperate. Name us. Walt. Free us. I clutched the key, its cross cutting my palm. How? I asked, voice breaking. Luther pointed to a stone slab in the chamber's center, unmarked but heavy, like it held the weight of the world. Speak them, he said, or they stay buried forever. I backed toward the passage, fear choking me. The slab seemed to hum, and I swore I saw it shift, like something was pushing from below. Luther's form flickered, his face less human now, more like a mask of shadow and stitches. I ran, the whispers chasing me up the passage, the gate still open, but feeling like a trap. Outside, the cemetery was dark, the unmarked graves silent but waiting. I knew I couldn't run forever. The names were mine to carry, and they were waking up. The cemetery air was thick with mist as I stumbled out of the underground passage, the key burning in my pocket like a coal. The names Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo, and the others echoed in my skull, their whispers clinging to me like damp earth. I leaned against the iron gate, its rusted bars cold under my hands, and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. That chamber, those carved names, my signature scratched beside them. I'd been part of something evil, and I couldn't hide from it anymore. I saw it clearly now, the memories cutting through the fog of years. Elias in the church basement, his red-draped table glowing under candlelight, his voice weaving promises of salvation while Ironton crumbled in the 80s. I'd been a wreck mill's shut, Maggie gone, whiskey my only friend. Elias said the red vespers would save the town, that God needed sacrifices. I'd believed him, or at least I'd wanted to, and I'd dug. 23 graves, 23 people, their cries muffled as I sealed their caskets. I sank to my knees in the cemetery, the unmarked mounds staring back like accusations. Luther's words, "You were the key holder," hit harder than ever. He wasn't just a ghost, he was the last of them, the final sacrifice. And he'd come back to make me face it. The stone slab in the chamber, the one he'd pointed to, felt like the key to it all. Speak them, he'd said. But speaking their names meant admitting what I'd done, and I wasn't sure I could carry that weight. A noise snapped me out of it, a low creak from the gate. I turned, heart pounding, but nothing was there, just another note, pinned to the ground with a rock, its red ink glaring. Say their names, Walt, or join them. My hands shook as I stuffed it in my pocket. Someone in Ironton was watching, someone who knew my sins. I looked at the church, its steeple a black spike against the dawn. The answers were down there, under that slab, and I couldn't run anymore. I went back to the church, the key heavy as a curse. The basement was colder now, the air thick with that sour decay smell, like the earth itself was rotting. My flashlight flickered as I descended the passage to the chamber, the walls closing in, the carved names Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo glowing faintly, like they were alive. Luther was there, standing by the stone slab, his stitched face half-shadow, his eyes unblinking. "You're here," he said, voice like a wind through bones. I gripped the key, my palms sweating. "What's under it?" I asked, nodding at the slab. It was heavy, unmarked, but it pulsed, like something was trapped beneath. Luther's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "The truth," he said. "Name them." And see, I wanted to scream, I didn't know how. But the memories were sharper now, caskets closing, dirt falling. Elias's chants drowning out their screams. I'd buried them alive, hypnotized by his words, thinking it was for Ironton's soul. I knelt by the slab, my hands trembling as I traced its edges. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices, Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo begging to be heard. I tried to speak, but my throat closed up, guilt choking me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but it wasn't enough. Luther stepped closer, his form flickering, less human now, more like a shadow stitched together. "They don't want apologies," he said. "They want their names." I pressed my hands to the slab, and it was warm, pulsing like a heart. I saw flashes, Clara's hands clawing at wood, Thomas's voice breaking, Mary Jo's prayers fading. My signature was on their graves. My hands had sealed them in. "Clara Hensley," I said, voice shaking. The slab trembled, the whispers softening, like a sigh of relief. I said another Thomas Pike and the air lightened. But Luther's eyes darkened. "All of them," he said, his voice sharp now, almost angry. I backed away, fear clawing at me. The slab seemed to shift, a crack forming at its edge, like something was pushing up. Luther's form flickered again, his stitches unraveling. "Finish it," he said, and the chamber shook, dust falling from the ceiling. I ran for the passage, the key slipping from my hand, the names screaming in my head. I wasn't ready, not yet, but the truth was breaking free, and it wasn't letting me go. I stumbled out of the passage, the chamber's whispers chasing me like a swarm. Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo, all 23 names screaming for release. The key was gone, dropped in my panic, but its weight lingered in my bones. The cemetery was dark, the unmarked graves glowing faintly under a moonless sky, their silence louder than any sound. Ironton felt like a trap, its rusted mills and empty streets closing in, and I was the prey. I couldn't go home, not with Luther's words. Finish it burning in my head, his form, unraveling like thread. Wasn't human anymore, but something else. Something tied to the slab in that chamber. I saw it clearly now. Elias's red vespers weren't just rituals. They were a curse, and I'd been his hands, burying people alive to save a dying town. Clara's cries, Thomas's pleas, Mary Jo's prayers, they were real, trapped in my memory, clawing their way out. I returned to the church, the basement window gaping like a mouth. The passage was colder now, the air thick with decay, and the chamber felt smaller, the walls pulsing with the names carved into them. The stone slab in the center was cracked, a thin fracture running across it, like something had pushed from below. I knelt, my hands trembling, and whispered, "Mary Jo Weaver." The crack widened, the whispers softening, but the air grew heavier, pressing on my chest. I said another name, Thomas Pike, and the slab shook, dust falling from the ceiling. The voices quieted, but Luther appeared, his stitches gone, his face a shifting shadow. "More," he said, his voice a low growl. I wanted to run, but my legs were lead. I'd buried them, signed their names, sealed their fates. Naming them was all I had left, but each word felt like a confession, tearing me apart. The chamber was a tomb, its walls alive with the names I'd carved, 23 lives I'd buried under Elias's spell. The slab's crack was wider now, a faint glow seeping from below, like something was waking. I clutched the flashlight, its beam shaking as I spoke another name, Clara Hensley. The slab groaned, the glow brightening, and the whispers stilled, like a held breath. Luther stood across from me, his form barely holding together, his eyes black pits. "Keep going," he said, voice like a blade. I saw them now. In flashes, Clara's hands clawing at the casket, Thomas's voice breaking, Mary Jo's prayers fading into silence. I'd stood over their graves, shovel in hand, while Elias chanted about salvation. The mill closures had broken Ironton, broken me, and I'd followed him, drunk and desperate, thinking I was saving something. But I'd buried them alive, hypnotized by his words, my signature sealing their fates. I said another name, Samuel Cole, and the slab split further. The glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Faces flickered in the dark, faint and gray, their eyes pleading. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. I didn't know. I choked out. But Luther's shadow loomed closer. "You chose," he said. "You dug." The air was suffocating, the chamber shrinking, the names pressing in like walls. I named them all. One by one, Ellen Reed, Jacob Marsh, Lila Dunn, each word a knife in my gut. The slab cracked open, the glow blinding now, and the voices sighed, like they were finally free. But Luther didn't fade. His form grew sharper, his face almost mine, his eyes accusing. "One left," he said, pointing to the slab. I looked down, and my breath stopped. A name was carved there, fresh and deep. Wallace Garner. I froze, the chamber spinning, my name, my grave. The faces in the dark watched, silent now, waiting. "No," I whispered. But Luther's hand gripped my shoulder, cold as death. "Say it," he said. I couldn't. Naming myself meant facing something worse than guilt, something I'd been running from since the mills died, and Elias made me his key holder. The slab pulsed, the glow swallowing me, and I knew the truth wasn't just under the stone. It was in me. The chamber pulsed around me, the glow from the cracked slab blinding, like a heart beating under the stone. My name, Wallace Garner, was carved there, fresh and deep, accusing me. The air was thick, choking, filled with the whispers of the 23 I'd named Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo, all free now, their voices fading. But Luther stood there, his form fraying into shadow, His eyes black voids. "Say it," he growled, his grip on my shoulder cold as the grave. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My name on that slab meant I wasn't just the key holder, I was one of them. One of Elias's sacrifices. The memories flooded back. The red vespers. The basement. Elias's voice weaving lies about saving Ironton while I dug. I saw myself, drunk and broken, sealing caskets, hearing cries I ignored. But me, buried. My mind recoiled, but the truth was clawing up, undeniable. I'd been part of the ritual, maybe the last, and somehow I'd walked away. Forgetting, the slab shuddered, the crack widening, light spilling out like blood. The faces in the dark, Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo watched. Their eyes not accusing now, but waiting. "Wallace Garner," I whispered, my voice breaking. The chamber shook, the walls groaning, and Luther's form flickered, his shadow stretching across the slab. "Finish it," he said. But his voice wasn't his anymore. It was mine, echoing from somewhere deep inside. I fell to my knees, the flashlight rolling away, plunging the chamber into a pulsing glow. The names were silent now, but the weight of my own name crushed me. I'd buried myself in Ironton's decay, in Elias's lies, in the whiskey that dulled the screams. The slab split further, and I swore I saw hands reaching up, pale and thin, not grabbing, just reaching. I wanted to run, but there was no outrunning. I was the last name, the final key. I crawled out of the chamber, the passage collapsing behind me, dust choking the air. The church basement was dark. The oak door slammed shut, but the key was still in my pocket, its cross engraving warm now, like it was alive. I stumbled into the cemetery, dawn breaking over Ironton, the mill's smokestacks stark against a blood-red sky. The unmarked graves were still there, but they felt different, lighter, like the earth had exhaled. I drove to the cemetery's edge, where the town began, and saw people gathering Jenny from the diner, old Mrs. Hargrove, even the trucker from that night. They stood by the unmarked graves, silent, their faces heavy with something like guilt. I clutched the files, the ones with my signature, and walked to them. "Clara Hensley," I said, voice steady now. "Thomas Pike, Mary Jo Weaver." I named them all, one by one, and the crowd listened, some crying, some nodding, like they'd known all along. Jenny stepped forward, her eyes red. "We let it happen," she said. "Elias said it would save us." I nodded, the weight of my own name still burning. I'd been the key holder, but the town had been complicit, turning away while Elias worked his curse. I pulled out a chisel from my truck, knelt by the first grave, and carved Clara Hensley. 1983. The crowd watched, silent. As I moved to the next, Thomas Pike, 1985. Each name felt like a release, the air growing clearer, the whispers gone. But Luther wasn't there. I looked for him, expecting his stitched face, his shadow, but the cemetery was empty except for us. I carved the last name, Lila Dunn, and the ground seemed to sigh, the mist lifting. Then I saw it, hidden in the weeds, a final mound, unmarked, untouched. I knelt, brushing the dirt, and found a stone, half buried, with my name. Wallace Garner. My hands froze. The crowd didn't notice. Their eyes on the graves I'd named. I stood, the chisel heavy in my hand. The town was remembering, but I wasn't done. My name was still buried, and whatever Luther was, he'd left me to face it alone. The sky darkened, and I knew the final truth was waiting, and it was mine to uncover. The chisel trembled in my hand as I stared at the stone half buried in the weeds. My name carved into it, Wallace Garner. The cemetery was silent. The crowd of townsfolk, Jenny, Mrs. Hargrove, the others still gathered around the graves I'd named, their faces heavy with grief and shame. Dawn's red light bled over Ironton, painting the mill's smokestacks like wounds against the sky. I'd named the 23 Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo, all of them, but this stone, my stone, was different. It wasn't just a marker, it was a mirror. I knelt, brushing dirt from the letters. My heart pounded, each beat echoing the whispers that had haunted me. You were the key holder, Luther had said, but why was my name here? Had I been part of the Red Vespers, not just as Elias's tool, but as a sacrifice? The memories were sharper now, his voice. The candles, the caskets closing, but they stopped short, like a page torn out. I saw myself digging, but not my own grave. Or had I? The crowd didn't see the stone, didn't see me shaking as I gripped the chisel. I wanted to carve over it, erase my name, but my hands wouldn't move. The air grew heavy, the smell of rust and earth choking me. I felt eyes on me, not the townsfolk, but something else, watching from the shadows. Luther. I scanned the cemetery, but he was gone, his stitched face nowhere in the mist. Yet I felt him, his voice in my head. Say it, I whispered. Wallace Garner. And the ground shuddered, the stone sinking slightly, like it was pulling me in. The crowd gasped, finally noticing, their eyes wide with fear. Jenny stepped forward, her voice trembling. Walt, what's happening? I couldn't answer. The stone was warm now, pulsing, and I knew if I didn't face this, it would swallow me whole. I stood over the stone, my name glaring up like an accusation. The crowd backed away, their whispers mixing with the wind. What's he doing? What's that stone? Ironton's decay surrounded us, the mill's skeletons watching. The town's guilt laid bare. I'd named the others, freed them, but my name was the last lock, the final key in Elias's curse. The Red Vespers weren't just about saving Ironton, they were about binding us all, and I'd been the one to seal it. I raised the chisel, my hand steady for the first time in days. Wallace Garner, I said again, louder, carving the letters deeper. The stone cracked, a low groan rising from the earth, and the air turned cold, sharp with the smell of decay. The crowd scattered, Jenny shouting my name, but I didn't stop. I saw it all now, Elias's basement, the red cloth, the candles, my own hands digging my grave. I'd been the last sacrifice, hypnotized, buried alive, but somehow I'd walked away, my memory erased, my life a lie. The stone split, a blinding light spilling out, and Luther appeared. His form no longer human, just shadow and ash. His eyes burning. You were the key, he said. Voice a chorus of the dead. You broke the pact. The light pulsed, and I saw them, Clara. Thomas, Mary Jo. Their faces clear now, not angry but sad, their hands reaching not for revenge but release. I carved again, the chisel biting deep, and the ground shook. The crack widening, the light swallowed me, and I was falling, not into the earth, but into memory, my own casket. The dirt falling, Elias's voice fading. I'd woken up, somehow, and crawled out, but the curse had held me, kept me blind. Now, naming myself, I was breaking it. The chamber's glow faded, the voices stilled, and Luther's form crumbled, ash scattering in the wind. I collapsed, the chisel slipping from my hand. The crowd was gone, the cemetery silent, my stone hole but unmarked now, like it had never been. I was free, but the weight of what I'd done buried them. Buried myself clung to me. Ironton was waking up, but I wasn't sure I could. The cemetery was still as I stood over the cracked stone. My name, Wallace Garner, fading into the dirt like a ghost. The chisel lay at my feet, its edge worn from carving the names of the 23 Clara, Thomas, Mary Jo, all freed by my voice. Ironton's dawn was cold. The mill's smokestacks black against a sky bleeding red. The townsfolk had fled, their footsteps fading, but their guilt lingered, heavy as the mist. I'd broken the Red Vesper's curse, named the forgotten, but my own name still burned. A final weight I couldn't shake. I picked up the chisel and started again, carving new stones for the unmarked graves. Each name felt like a prayer. Clara Hensley, 1983. Thomas Pike, 1985. Mary Jo Weaver, 1987. My hands bled, the cold biting deeper with each stroke. But I kept going, the cemetery humming with a quiet peace. The whispers were gone, the air lighter, like the earth had exhaled. I saw their faces in my mind, not pleading now, but calm, their eyes soft with gratitude. Jenny came back, standing at the cemetery's edge, watching me work. "You're doing right, Walt," she said, voice soft. I nodded, too tired to speak. The town had known, had let Elias's madness fester, but naming the dead was my burden, my redemption. I carved the last name Lila Dunn, and the ground settled. The glow from the cracked slab in the chamber below fading to nothing. Luther was gone, his shadow scattered, his purpose fulfilled. The curse was broken, but I felt hollow, like I'd left something of myself in that chamber. I looked at my stone, unmarked now, but it still felt like mine. I'd been buried, somehow, and walked away. But the man I was Elias's keyholder, the drunk who dug graves, was dead. I dropped the chisel, my hands shaking, and turned to Jenny. "Tell them," I said. "Tell Ironton their names." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and I knew she would. I walked away from the cemetery, the new stones gleaming under the rising sun. Ironton was waking up, its streets stirring with life for the first time in years. The mills stood silent, but the air felt different, like the town could breathe again. I'd named the 23, freed them, and the weight of their graves was gone. But my own name, Wallace Garner, still hung heavy, a shadow I couldn't outrun. I went home, the house creaking under my steps, the whiskey bottle untouched on the counter. I sat in the dark, The old photo of me and Elias staring up from the table. His smile mocked me, but it was fading. Like the curse, I saw it all now. The red vespers, the caskets, my own burial. I'd been the last sacrifice, hypnotized, buried alive to seal Elias's pact. But I'd crawled out, my memory shattered, living a half-life while the others stayed trapped. Naming them had freed them, but naming myself had broken something deeper. I stepped onto the porch, the air crisp, the town quiet but alive. A breeze carried the smell of the river, clean for once, not sour with rust. I felt lighter, but not whole. The cemetery called. One last time, and I walked back, drawn to the stone that had borne my name. It was blank now, just a slab in the weeds. But I knelt beside it, my fingers tracing the dirt. I thought I buried the dead, I said, my voice low. But maybe I've been the buried one all along. The words hung in the air, and the ground stayed still. No whispers, no shadows. Luther was gone, the faces in the dark at peace. But I wasn't. I'd named them, given them back to Ironton. But my name was mine to carry, a scar I'd never erase. I stood, the town waking behind me, and walked toward the river. The sun climbed higher, and I knew I'd keep going, carrying the names, the truth, and the man I'd been. Ironton would remember, and so would I.